prayer. Father, we thank you for this day and this time. We thank you, God, for the opportunity, God, to come together. We thank you, Lord, just for men, oh God, who desire to be in your will and to be the leaders in their home, the husband to their wives, and the fathers to their children, and leaders in the community, and God, sons to you. Lord, we just ask that you would touch us now. Bless us. Holy Spirit, move in us, to us, through us, and for us, that we might learn and know what it is your will is for us as we go through this session. Bless us now one by one and all together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so the title of this session is The Mature Man. And it comes from my soon-to-be released book, God is Looking for a Mature Man. And the question that we pose throughout is, where are you, man? Well, just some logistics. Tonight is the first night. We'll meet for the next 3 Wednesdays right here in this room. Tonight we'll talk about identity and purpose. Next week we'll talk about wellness, wholeness, and holiness. And then on the 20th, right before I leave for China, I'm going to China, y'all. Leaving on the 22nd. That night we'll talk about the worker, the warrior, and the worshiper. All right. So the essential question, or the overarching question for the entire seminar is, where are you? Right, and that goes back to Genesis when after Adam sinned and was disobedient, he went and hid himself. He was hiding because he was afraid. He knew he had been disobedient to what God instructed him to do. And so he went and hid himself, and God came calling through the cool of the day, and he said, where are you, Adam? And he asked the question not because he didn't know where Adam was, but he wanted Adam to recognize that he had separated himself from his creator. And so he posed the question, where are you? And I asked that question because I believe that question needs to be asked even today, and is being asked today. Where are you, man? Where are the men? And I asked the question because I believe a lot of the ills in society, a lot of the social ills that we see in our society is because men have failed to meet the expectations and the responsibilities that were given, the instructions that were given from the very beginning. So we pose the question, where are you? Now, understand, even though we're posing questions, right, it's not for me to tell you where you are. It's not for you to tell me where I am. But it's for each of us to kind of look at our own self, to examine our own self, and see where we are based on what God's expectations for us are. So let every man examine himself, all right, as we go through these sessions. And this is just a little bit of research. Men are struggling with issues, as we stated, issues of identity, low levels of achievement, dropout, homicides, high rates of homicides, low life expectancy, suicide rates, AIDS and STDs and incarceration rates, the whole gamut, unemployment, and these quality of life indicators, again, I believe because men, because of their failures and the fear that comes with it, have separated themselves from the original intent and role that was given to them by our Creator. So tonight we're going to talk about 2 great questions. I call them 2 great questions, and I believe these questions are important for every person, every individual, male or female, black, white, rich, poor. Whether you're American or Chinese, it doesn't matter. Every individual that's born to this life has to respond to these two questions, and so we're going to get at these questions in tonight's session. And the first question we talk about is, who are you? Who are you? And again, when we pose the question, we're not just talking about, what your name is. That's a part of who you are, but that's not the essence of who you are. There's a spiritual being that was created when you were brought forth into this life. And so we pose the question, where are you, or who are you? And every person has to answer that question, right? If not, we suffer, people suffer from an identity crisis. You see 40, 50-year-old men who still struggle with who they are, and therefore struggle with the follow-up question, which comes a little bit later, but I'll just let you know, is what is my purpose? Who am I, and what is my purpose? And so this whole fatherhood of Greater Norfolk men's session is all about helping fathers become better fathers and connect with their children, right? But before we can be better fathers, and before we can be better husbands to our wives, we have to be better men. So before we talk about fatherhood and being a husband, we have to talk about manhood. And so this scripture, I have it up in a proverb. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't depart. Well, we need to know and understand the way that we should go. And it's according to our identity, as well as the purpose for which we've been born. All right, this is also from research. This is Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development. We kind of glean from his developmental processes to kind of talk through this process of identity development and identity achievement as we move and progress through our lives. So the first 18 months all the way up into your elder of years. So the first 18 months of a child's life, and just so you know, each stage there are key, and let me just go back for a second. Each stage there's a key relationship, specific crisis, and a virtue that should come out of each stage. Now, when you'll see that for the crisis, there's a trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, right? So if the needs of the child and the relationships that should develop in these stages happen, then you get the positive, you get trust. But if it don't happen, if it doesn't happen, then you get mistrust. So if the mother is in the child's life and the child's needs are met during that stage, then the child develops a sense of trust, and thereby leaves that first stage with a sense of hope. Right? But as I said, the opposite is also true. If the child doesn't get what he or she needs in the first 18 months of his or her life, right? Instead of feeling a sense of trust, a sense of mistrust. And instead of hope, a sense of hopelessness. And understand, we're only talking about the first year and a half of a child's life. And so if a child in the first year and a half of his or her life doesn't get what he or she needs, they move on to the next stage with a deficit. And so, as you can see, you'll start to see as children develop, they're either gonna grow and prosper, or deficits are gonna accumulate, right? And when deficits accumulate, the child begins to struggle. And you all, some of you have worked in the school systems or wherever. In the school system, we call them special needs, right? They're special needs because they didn't get some things that they should have gotten during the developmental stages in prior years. Right, so let's just talk about this. All right, so again, we say in the first 18 months of a child's life, that child needs to develop, and the primary relationship we all know and understand is the mother. Right? That's why the mother, she becomes that nurturer. She breastfeeds. Why? Because there's a bond that's being developed between that child and the mother. Right? She talks to the child. She cares for the child. You know, when the child needs to be changed or fed, she's always there nurturing and caring for that child, so that child understands that he or she is loved, he or she is protected, they're going to be encouraged and supported. And then when those things happen and take place and the bond between that child and the mother is developed, the child develops a sense of trust. Right? Again, if those things don't happen, if the mother, let's say, is, you know, for example, in African American community, I'm not sure if you knew, but 1 in 3, 1 out of 3, young ladies between the ages of 13 and 18 in the African American community have a baby. Between the ages of 13 and 18, 1 in 3. So if you have what we call as babies having babies, then you can see how a cycle is created where the child doesn't get all of what he or she needs. Why? Because you have a mother who's in the stage, in a crisis herself. And so it's really easy to see how a cycle of deficits can begin in this very first stage. Again, if you have any questions or you have a comment, just raise your hand. We won't keep it informed. So we move on to the second stage. Go ahead, Miss.
I'd like to update that a little bit,
Go
because
ahead.
I understand that during the time that this theory was made, the majority of the children were with their moms.
Mm-hmm.
But I would change that mother to caregiver, whoever that caregiver is, whether that's the mom, whether that's Aunt Sally, whoever that is that's raising up that child during that particular time, or whether it's the dad. You know, so I mean, I understand what the theory is saying, but for these current times, I think caregiver would be a much more appropriate.
And caregiver is, because we understand that because of the family structure has really eroded, right? It could be grandma, it could be auntie, it could be a cousin, it could be foster parents, adoptive parents that's actually giving care to the child. But ideally, it would be the mother who bonds with that child in the first 18. So I understand what our reality is, right? What we're dealing with, right? What we're faced with right now. The practical reality is that whoever the caregiver is, and it could be everybody from grandma to cousin or some neighbor around the corner, that's actually giving care to the child. But ideally, it would be the mother that the child bonds with. Again, and I like to bring up the breastfeeding, because anybody can't breastfeed the child, and so you can understand the need for a bond that a child develops coming into this world through not just breastfeeding, but the care that's given to that child by its mother those first months of his or her life. That's very important. But again, as Ms. Lily said, we know that's not happening. But understand, because that is not the case, that's not our reality in a lot of cases, is the reason why many of our children have deficits. They develop deficits. And if you talk to me, some of you work with teenagers. How many times have you heard a teenager, male or female, say, "I don't trust anybody"? Right? They'll tell you, "I don't trust anybody." Why? It goes back to not getting their needs met very early in life. Right? That's a deficit that hasn't been resolved. in their life. So they struggle with trusting people, right? So again, we move on to the second stage, autonomy versus shame and guilt. Now we have what people like to call, I don't like to call, the terrible twos, right? Toddlers, right? And because I believe, you know, we know toddlers like to do what? They like to throw tantrums. Well, I believe they throw what we call tantrums, not because they just want to be terrible or bad, right? But it's because they're frustrated, not being able to communicate what it is they need or want, right? We have a language. We know how to talk to one another and communicate. A child who is at this age, their language hasn't developed yet. And so when they want something or need something and can't communicate that, they become frustrated. And so they act out in ways that we call tantrums, and you know, hence the term terrible twos. But again, in this stage, the important relationship is the mother and the father together. And again, we're talking ideally, right? The mother and the father, and the mother, again, she remains that nurturer in the child's life, right? She's always giving love, protection, encouragement, and support to that child. But in this stage, the father, not that he shouldn't be there in the first 18 months of the child's life, but in this stage, he takes on a greater role in that he now comes alongside the mother, and as she nurtures, he becomes the voice of authority and structure in the child's life. So now the child has a balance. They get nurtured, as well as they're disciplined, or they have a sense of structure and learn boundaries, right? And so the child develops further, and again, now instead of just one hedge of love, protection, encouragement, and support, now the father comes alongside and becomes that second hedge of love, protection, encouragement, and support. And so if that's given to the child during this stage, they develop a sense of autonomy, right? They want to explore, a sense of initiative. You know, they want to do it themselves. But again, if it doesn't, to the contrary, they can develop a sense of shame and doubt, and not feel sure of themselves, or maybe embarrassed or not confident in who they are, or what they can and do, what their boundaries are, right? And so the virtue that we want them to develop is a sense of will, right? They have a will to do. Remember, and each of these stages is building towards something, right? So in the first stage, it was hope, right? And if they develop the hope, that's good. They have a foundation in hope. We know hope is tied to what? Faith, right? And so now we're moving on to the second stage, and we're talking about the will. If they have the nurturing they need in the second stage, they develop a will. But contrary, if not, the will can be broken. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the traditional family eroding. What do you see as the biggest contributor of the
erosion
of the traditional family?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that's exactly why we're here. Going back to manhood. Again, I started off by saying many of the ills, I believe, many of the ills in society today is because man has failed to live up to his responsibilities. He's failed to be a husband to his wife, a father to his children, a leader in the community, and ultimately failed and been disobedient as to the instructions that were given from the beginning. So to your question, I believe the man is the primary reason that we have so many dysfunctions in families. I also believe man is the answer to restoring the family. All right? Appreciate your question. All right, so we move on now to the child that's 4 or 5 years old, and now that third hedge becomes the core family, where it's not just the mother, the father, but now the siblings are all involved and become a hedge of love, protection, encouragement, and support for this child. And just think about this: if you have a child who's developing in these stages, and their needs are being met, you're talking about a foundation that's being established where that child knows and understands that he or she has a support group, has a support system, is going to get that love, protection, encouragement, and support from their mother, from their father, from their sibling. And these are close, intimate relationships. A child that understands they have somebody, or somebody has their back, right, gives that child a whole lot of confidence, and actually for this stage develops a sense of purpose. Right? They begin to develop a sense of purpose. And remember the questions that we asked, the two great questions: who am I and what is my purpose? So the positive thing